people want their lives to be happy. That's not shocking. They also want their lives to have meaning. People also want their lives to have psychological richness, meaning diversity in them. So people will sacrifice smiles and a sense of purpose in order to have something different.
Hello, everybody. As Daniel said, I'm Sally Halderson. I am managing director of Porchlight Book Company. We are a bulk bookseller here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just across the city from Boswell Book Company. And today we are so glad to be here to welcome Cass Sunstein, who is the author of Look Again, The Power of Noticing What Was Always There, also co-authored by Tally Sherratt. And it came out just yesterday from Atria Books. And as usual, I do a little introduction, and then we're going to pass over the floor to, I guess you can't pass over the floor, but you get my drift, over to Cass. So anyone who knows me or has probably been on one of these Zoom webinars before has likely heard me go on and on about what I've always called the irony of adaptability. And that is how we humans are so fortunate to have the ability to adapt to even the most dire situations, let's say a health crisis. But that same ability to adapt can make us unable to recognize when we've become too passive and are unable to move from the habits we've acquired while adapting. There's a very delicate balance between recognizing what we can't change and acting on what we can. Our guest today, with his co-author, has a more precise and scientific explanation for this conundrum of the human experience: habituation. In order to recognize and appreciate what we have in life, a relationship, a workplace, a society, we often have to look at it again and see it with fresh eyes. And because of habituation, that's often hard to do and requires moments of dishabituation, when we take breaks or test out new experiences or make a change to reorient us, keeping us moving forward so that we can be intentional about where we are. There's so much to be learned about habituation, how we combat it, but also how we benefit from it. And here's Cass Sunstein to tell us how this human tendency comes into play in situations ranging from making decisions, raising children, changing the course of history, to job changes, social media, discrimination, and to understanding and hopefully defying tyranny. But ultimately, his new book, Look Again, will help us, most importantly, recognize ourselves. Thank you for joining us, Cass. And this is going to be a really fun conversation.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Shall I read a little from the book?
Yes, please. Okay. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit to our audience and let them know the most important things about where you're at in life right now and what brings you to this book?
Great. So my name is Cass Sunstein. I'm a law professor in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at a university whose name you might well know. I've worked periodically for the US government. I got to work for President Obama. I got to work for President Biden. I work on constitutional law, which we're not going to talk about a whole lot. I work also on human behavior and its relationship to law and public policy. And I really like Labrador retrievers.
Which means we really like you as a fellow dog person. Okay, so you're going to read a little bit for us to introduce us to the book, as most people have not yet had a chance to read it, but I'm sure this is just one of the things that are going to compel people to place that order.
Okay, that's great. So this book was and is a labor of love. And here's a little excerpt. What was the best day of your life? You might find it tough to select the very best day. That's fine. Just choose, would you, a really good day? Some people ask that question, think back to their wedding day. Others choose the day a child was born or their graduation day. Others give a kind of idiosyncratic answer. They might say the day I breakdanced with my, forgive me, Labrador Retriever on the roof, or the day I gave a speech about the fear of public speaking. As long as it was a great day, it qualifies. Now imagine, if you would, reliving that day. It's sunny out, the sky is blue, you're running on the beach in your yellow bathing suit. Or maybe the sky is dark, the snow is falling, you warm your red nose against that of a newfound love. Whatever it is, it's great. Now imagine reliving that day again, again, and again, and again. You are trapped in the best day of my life loop. What will happen? What will happen is that the best day of your life will become less exciting, less fun, less joyful, and less meaningful. Soon, the best day of your life is going to start to become tedious. The sun won't feel as warm, the snow not so magical, your love not so perfect, your mentors not as wise. What is thrilling on Monday becomes boring on Friday. We habituate, which means that we respond less and less to stimuli that repeat. That's our nature. Even those things that you once found exhilarating, a relationship, a job, a song, a work of art, lose their sparkle after a while. Studies show that people even start habituating to the magic of a tropical vacation about 43 hours after arrival. Then it's less. But what if you could restore your sense of amazement about those things that you've stopped feeling or noticing? What if you could, to some extent, dishabituate? That's what this book is about. We'll ask what might happen if people were able to overcome habituation in the office, in the bedroom, or on the athletic field. What would be the impact on happiness, relationships, work, and community? And how would you go about doing that? We will see how changing the rules, changing the people with whom you interact, and taking real or imagined breaks from ordinary life can help you regain sensitivity and start noticing what it is that you barely see.
Thank you very much. That touches on so much that we're going to move through in this conversation. And I want to start with, for anyone who isn't familiar with habituation or dishabituation, can you define those for us and tell us how our brains are wired to do these things?
Okay, let's take some simple examples. You're about to swim in the ocean. It's, let's say, July, so it's going to be okay. The first moments you are thinking, man, it is cold and horrible. But after, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, come on in, the water's fine. Mm-hmm. Or you're about to take a bath and you ran it and it's scalding hot, and you touch it with your leg and you feel it's burning. Mm-hmm. But after a little while, it just doesn't feel that hot anymore. Or you go into a room where there's some smell, maybe someone smoking, maybe there's not a Labrador Retriever or a great dog like yours and mine, but a good dog who happens to have made a little bit of a smell, and feel in the first few minutes, that's horrible. But after a very short time, even if the smell doesn't recede, you will feel it recede. You won't notice it much at all. If you are undergoing some sort of medical procedure and you're conscious, the first moments might be extremely jarring, but you habituate to it. Mm-hmm. So these are examples of reduced sensitivity to stimuli, mm-hmm. whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. What was once full of color turns gray the more we're exposed to it.
And then for dishabituation, once we have become habituated or adapted to a certain environment or a certain situation, then dishabituating can either be something that happens to us or that we can enact on our own, right?
Completely. So suppose you're in a job and you're kind of bored by it, and your boss says, you're kind of bad at your job. I'm going to suspend you for a month and get your act together and then come back. You've been involuntarily dishabituated. You come back and things that were gray, maybe they're fantastic and you are no longer noticing them so much, or maybe they're pretty bad and you stop noticing them. You'll see what's good and bad much more brightly. Maybe some people who listening have had that experience. Or you can say, I'm kind of feeling routinized in my life. I'm going to move to another city. I'm just going to move, even if it's, 30 miles away. It's not very far. And then you're in a place that's 30 miles away. And my gosh, the same kinds of trees and sights that you basically didn't pay attention to at all. It's a new place. Look at the green, look at the colors, look at the neighborhood.
Right.
And that's intentional dishabituation.
So in the first section of the book, which is the first part is titled Well-Being, and then the first chapter is about happiness. And I think this was a good entry into that when you're talking about making a change in your life, right? And in the chapter, you have statistics about happiness. And one of them you mentioned in what you read earlier, where we often think that vacations and the longer vacations that we take are going to make us happier, when in actuality, the data seems to show that, was it 43 hours into a vacation, we tend to sort of return back to our happiness stasis point? Or you can explain, if you'll explain that, I'm sure people will be very interested in that. But then also how we apply that to other areas of our life. It is very common, and it's an example you give in the book about choosing to change a job. And you might choose to change a job because you are in a suboptimal situation, or you might choose to change a job because you are a sensation seeker or you're looking for something new. How can we use this framework of habituation and dishabituation to test our happiness level, whether it's vacation or in our jobs?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about the general and then the particular. So some people are explorers in the sense that the idea of a staycation makes them a little sick. The idea of going to the same restaurant they went to last week makes them think, you've got to be kidding. They want to try a new place. They want to go to a new vacation spot. The idea of staying home over a weekend. No, go out, try something new. My wife is that. She's an explorer. Other people are exploiters, it's called, which doesn't mean you exploit other people, but you will exploit your stock of things. So for such people, the idea of a staycation brings a bright smile. The idea of going to the vacation spot that you're used to is really great. The idea of doing what is customary in your life makes you feel calm and joyful. So there are explorers who need variety, and there are exploiters, and I confess I'm an exploiter, who like what's stable. And sometimes in couples, by the way, one is an explorer and one is an exploiter. That might be because each needs kind of a sense of the other. Okay, a good speculation is that the exploiters don't habituate as much as the explorers. Meaning if you habituate, then your staycation is going to seem like a mini death. Why are you just doing the same thing again? If you're an exploiter who hasn't fully habituated to the wonder, let's say, of your neighborhood, then it's not a mini death. It's just a small form of life. Now, in terms of making changes, now let's talk about the specifics. People want their lives to be happy. That's not shocking. They also want their lives to have meaning. People also want their lives to have psychological richness, meaning diversity in them. So people will sacrifice smiles and a sense of purpose in order to have something different. So it might be that, they'll go someplace for a weekend, or they'll develop a hobby, or they'll do something more major. Maybe they'll change jobs. Maybe they'll, dye their hair. Maybe they'll do something large or small, just have something different. And that's how our species is. We need that variety, that diversity, that psychological richness, because even happiness and meaning can get old after a while. They also turn a little bit gray, even if they're fantastic. And that means that even the exploiters who like staycations, people like me, we need variety too. And that's maybe underrated by some of us. Now, with respect to change in specifics, we have data that's suggesting that strongly suggests for people who are thinking, should I change my job? Should I change my city? Should I do something pretty dramatic, maybe get another kind of job? People are really on the fence. If you divide them into two groups, half is given a little bit of a nudge, let's say, to change, and half isn't. The half who are nudged are on average going to be better off than the half who don't. Just to say, people tend to underrate the boost in well-being that comes from a change. And I think that's because they underestimate their capacity to adapt to something that's scary. So they'll habituate to what they're worried about. And they also underestimate it's like a black and white TV turns color once you make a change. And people underestimate how enlivening that is.
It's an interesting, I certainly had aha moments as I was reading this, and like, oh, I'm an explorer. That's why I'm a busybody. Like, I often describe my brain as a junk drawer. Like, I like to collect a lot of things and then draw conclusions from a variety of bits and pieces. And so that this section can really help us recognize some of our tendencies. And of course, I'm not always like that. And my husband is not always, the opposite, but it's very interesting in terms of how we can recognize these tendencies, but then also perhaps ignite those moments of dishabituation for ourselves. If we are on the fence of change, thinking that, we're not risking everything by going for it, because studies show that it often pays off to do the next thing for that variety's sake. Also in this section on well-being I was going to do an elegant segue here, and now I've just fumbled that, but you were talking about vacation. And one of the things that I often experience when I'm on social media is seeing other people on vacation, and they are on beaches, and they are on their 4th vacation of the year. And I am in cold Wisconsin, or in 68-degree Wisconsin yesterday. And I have no vacations planned, and I get a real sense of envy or FOMO or whatever nervousness that brings into my psyche about my own life. So in your section on well-being, there is a chapter on social media. So let's talk about how social media has effect on well-being, and how it affects our perception of our own lives and what we might consider to be normal.
Okay, so social media has many fantastic qualities, so let's just acknowledge that. Here are some things that aren't so fantastic. As you say, it might be that if you're on social media, you're seeing your friends and acquaintances who are having the most amazing time in the most amazing places, or their kids have done something incredible. And it's, you wish them well, of course, but it's a little deflating to think, well, my life maybe seems pale compared to theirs. And it may be for them that they're highlighting their child's amazing month, but the child had 11 other months that were the opposite of amazing. And so you're getting a kind of distorted picture because of highlight, or people might be emphasizing their vacations, but it might be that that's because their ordinary life, which is most of their life, is really dreary and full of struggle, and you don't see that. So, the fact is, it's a little like seeing in high school the most popular kids and their excitement like all the time, and for people who aren't the most popular kids, you think things aren't going so great for me. So that's a negative. Another negative is that social media has a kind of addictive rote quality to it, which can produce a low-level anxiety and for some a low-level depression, where people are scrolling through, I don't know, X or on Facebook and just seeing one thing after another, and it's kind of frantic and edgy. And to stop doing it or not doing it seems hard or like you're missing something, but to keep doing it isn't good for your well-being. And we know that because of data suggesting that people who were asked how much money would you have to be paid to be off Facebook for a month, and they said, okay, $100, I'll go off for a month. And then a lot of the people who said that their offer was taken and they were given the $100 and were off Facebook for a month, compared to those whose offer was not taken. They stayed on Facebook. The people who were off for a month were less anxious, more satisfied with their life, happier with their life, and less depressed. Along every dimension, they were better off. I think part of it is the reason you describe, that they didn't have this comparison. Part of the reasons they were doing things that were more kind of humanly fulfilling or energizing than doing the scrolling. Mm-hmm. That means that being on social media a lot is probably like having some sort of dental thing in your mouth that hurts a little bit. And after a while, you get used to it so much that you don't even notice it. But it's there and putting some pressure on the gums. And once it's taken out, my gosh, life is free. That's probably part of the reason social media for many, I think especially teenagers, is a negative.
I think that that what's interesting about the book is that you're very careful to not bring a lot of judgment into the findings, right? Because what's good for some is not good for all, and what is good sometimes is not good other times. And I think what we were just talking about with social media and comparison is, as you say in the book, a really important part of the human experience, right? Like if we don't see what's possible, then we don't necessarily pursue it. If we are habituated, I think, I'm not going to be able to quote this right off, but you say something like, well, being habituated to having less sounds good. It also means we pursue less. And so there's this sort of fine balance between seeing what's out there and being uncomfortable with not having everything you dream of. Hello, capitalism, right? We know that. But so there's a drive to continue to do more and get more. But then where does that then become dangerous, where we have to modulate that keeping up with the Joneses? And how does habituation speak to that?
What you said is completely fantastic. So an inspiration for the book in the middle of writing it was my kind of vague recollection of an episode of the old TV show, The Twilight Zone, where there was a guy, forgive me, I'm going to tell you the plot of the show. There's a guy, a low-level crook, who is shot, and he wakes up and he finds himself in this beautiful place, and there's an evident angel named Pip who's with him. And he says, his name is Mr. Valentine, is the crook. And the crook says, you know, I'm just a terrible person. I was a crook all my life. Why am I here? And Pip says, what do you want? You can have anything you want, anything. And Mr. Valentine says, well, I want to live in a great place. And Pip says, done, you're in a great place. And he said, I want a lot of money, like a lot of money. Pip says, you got a lot of money. He says, I want all the women to fall in love with me. They do. He gets whatever he wants. And then after a few weeks, he's extremely agitated. Life is horrible for him. And he says, this is awful. I can't stand it. Everything I say, I get. This isn't tolerable. He says, I'd like to be in the other place. And then Pip says, oh, Mr. Valentine, this is the other place, which is a chilling line. It's just what you say. For humanity, hell, in a way, is constant satisfaction of all desires. So there's a line we use from a social scientist, which is happiness comes from the intermittent satisfaction of desires. That's what you need. Not all the time. There has to be striving. And if you're not striving, you're just, you got everything, then you might lose your mind, as in the episode, or you might have a midlife crisis. So the relative omnipresence of midlife crises in diverse nations for 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds has something to do with just what you said, that we need to be striving for things that are maybe unattainable or hard to attain. That's hardwired in us. And even if we don't succeed, our life is better because we had that goal of which we fell short.
I am still in part one, everyone who's watching, and I don't want to get stuck here, but I have one more question about well-being, and that is maybe the opposite scenario of what we're talking about when we're talking about vacations and we're talking about making choices when it comes to jobs and being able to make choices when it comes to jobs and striving for new things. And not everyone is fortunate enough to be in a place in their lives where that's the problem. And instead, we are, surprised by emergency. We are surprised by a health crisis. We're taken by surprise in as you mentioned earlier, the behavior of a child, the death of a pet. Any of these things that happen to us where we then need to respond to that moment and have some faith that we're going to get through it, right? And resilience is a huge component of that. And it's what I talked about in my opening. We have this ability to adapt, but we don't want to adapt to the bad situation so much that we never then strive to get out of it. So let's talk a little bit about resilience. We all talk about it a lot, and why it is so critical to maintaining this balance between habituation and dishabituation.
Okay, so what you said is fantastic, and I love your emphasis on surprise. So ancient your ancestors from a long time ago, they would swim. They didn't have legs. And if something changed, they'd start swimming a lot. And if things were steady, they wouldn't. This is unicellular organisms. So you and I are related, probably more approximately than this, but certainly by reference to the first living creatures who were very responsive to change and very unresponsive to stability. The human brain, like the canine brain, you and I both know, is very alert to surprise. So if there's a loud noise, or if there's a smell that's very unusual, or if you see something that just doesn't look right, surprise, exclamation point. It's like the sky is screaming. But if things are just as they've always been, there's not much of a signal. Okay, that's living creatures. Now on resilience, if you have a surprise signal, you may be jarred and thrown in a way that's either horrible or fantastic. So it might be that you see someone who you think is going to be the love of your life, surprise, exclamation point. And that's, that's not routine. Or it might be that someone you care about has a health problem. It might be your dog, God forbid. both of us, but that's a surprise exclamation point, and then you're flattened.
Mhm.
Now, here's what people are like, and this is very hard to know when you're in it. That once you are flattened, and this is in the book, I was actually hit by a car going 40 miles an hour, and I was literally flattened.
Mhm.
The people who don't have mental health struggles, they habituate to that. So
Mhm.
I was hit by a car and I habituated to my own smashedness. I'm completely fine now, I hasten to add, but I was kind of smashed up for a while, and it wasn't good, but it wasn't that terrible. Certainly wasn't as terrible as I would have expected, not nearly. And if people have a setback, they lose a job, they get a bad performance evaluation, something happens to their child, it's like a punch in the nose, but then there's recovery. That's just how we're wired. People who have schizophrenia or anxiety or depression, a characteristic linking feature for people with mental health challenges is they don't habituate, or they habituate a lot less. There's a resilience problem. Now, it
Mhm.
might be that at least some mental health challenges are associated with amazing creativity. That's partly also because there's an absence of habituation.
Mhm.
People with ADHD often see things that people without ADHD don't, because they're alert to everything, but they're not habituating so much, which
Mhm.
is why they're stimuli that are kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
So resilience and habituation are closely connected.
Mhm.
And I was once told by a professor friend before I started working on this book, I was living in New York because my wife had a job there and I couldn't stand it. I thought, it's so noisy, it's so crowded, it's so horrible. And he said, you're going to be fine. Wait 2 months, you're going to
Uh-huh.
habituate. He was right.
I was thinking about, as you were just talking, when I was younger, I was in the hospital quite a bit, having some surgeries and such. And I've always been fascinated by why the last thing you want to do, and I'm sure you had this experience when you were in the hospital, is to be in the hospital. But then once you've been there, the last thing you want to do is kind of leave the hospital. Like, there's a part of you that thinks, oh, but it's kind of nice. They bring you food and I'm just watching TV, and like, I don't know if I want to maneuver my stairs and all of this. And I would not have thought until now to realize that that is habituating to my circumstance and my ability to adapt to that, and then being afraid to then adapt to the next
Right.
version of
It's
that when I go home, right?
we're habituation. We are port in a storm, because the term can be understood in various ways, is diminishing sensitivity to stimuli. So once you're in the hospital, the things that aren't so good about it, we are decreasingly sensitive to. It's like cold water that we're swimming in,
Right.
and it's fine.
Yeah, the food is fine. Um, so I'm glad you mentioned creativity as we move to part 2 in the book, Thinking and Believing. You talk about creativity, and here's another example of where there isn't judgment happening here. There's not a better or worse in terms of being a slow habituator or a fast habituator, because in some scenarios, being a slow habituator and perhaps ruminating on where you're at might allow you to make something very creative about those moments of being there, where if you were a fast habituator, where you were able to get over a slight very quickly, you would not perhaps be in the space where you're going to make something to explore your feelings about it, or investigate why something happened. And so how does creativity and this sort of benefit of being slow to habituate actually serve a whole nother dimension of our lives?
Okay, so let's talk about two people. Dick Thaler, my collaborator
Right? Yeah.
on
But
Nudge, is probably the most important creative force behind behavioral economics, which is a renegade movement which has had very large impact, which denies the idea that human beings are perfectly rational. And it also specifies the ways in which human beings depart from perfect rationality. Now, he was a renegade. He didn't habituate to the world of economics. I'm not sure whether it was something in his personality or something in the environment in which he found himself. I think personality. So his creativity was associated with his, is it refusal? Was it self-conscious? Or is it just his nature, which is he wasn't going to be the water's fine here in economics. He was just thinking it's cold, it's cold, it's cold. Let's do something different.
Yeah.
Then there's Dick Fosbury, who invented the Fosbury flop, which is a way of doing the high jump, which is completely different from the way people had done it. It involved a different run. It involved a different way of going over the pole. And Fosbury was a determined athlete, but not clearly a destined for success athlete. He also was just not a habituating type. So he could see the sport kind of from a distance, the way that one might see a job before one has started. It's not like you're in it and you're or a hospital from a distance. You might think it's scary or you might think it's fantastic, but you'll see it with your nerves on edge. And that's how he saw the high jump, and he invented something completely new. We have data that is consistent with the proposition that people who habituate less frequently tend to be more creative than people who do habituate quickly. And that's because they're seeing colors everywhere. If they're seeing colors everywhere, they're thinking of reassembly rather than just going on the path.
It's an interesting explanation or elucidation on the creative personality, right? We talk a lot about, authors must be tortured, or artists must be have a certain kind of personality, and this does give some insight into why perhaps these different personality types can flourish in different moments. Go ahead.
The artist example is great. So it was discovered a long time ago that if you see a painting or an image of some kind with lots of colors, and in the middle there's a cross, not a religious cross, just a cross, you stare at the cross, the colors are going to disappear. They're going to turn gray. And this is on the spine of our book, and it's astounding to see it work. Tali Sharot, my neuroscientist co-author, drew it to my attention. And an artist is someone who sees colors everywhere. And whether literally true, take that as a metaphor, for they see things afresh. And I think you're right that people, Bob Dylan, Taylor Swift, I guess there are others, Mozart, Beethoven, they were composers too, right? It's not just Taylor Swift.
Not just Taylor Swift.
They see things afresh.
Yeah. And on that same, so then we flip that back, this whole book is about, untangling threads and then recombining them. And the next two chapters you have are on lying and on, actually it's misinformation, but I was going to go to risk, but anyway, it all applies. It's the woven thread. You talk a lot in the book about our emotional reaction to things, right? And as you mentioned, when you're going to run out into the very cold sea, you're going to jump off a diving board. That's what I was using, because that's a fear that I have. If I were up on that diving board, I would be, just infused with all of my fear of heights and, what's going to happen once I hit the water, all of this. What do people think? All the things. And that emotional reaction to that moment, if I eventually, because of peer pressure, jump off the diving board because there are people behind me, I'm like, oh, that's not that bad. Maybe I'll go again. And then maybe I'll go again. And then eventually the fifth time I'm jumping backwards, or I'm trying a backflip, or no, I'm not, but you know what I mean? And so the muting of our emotional reaction is really key to habituating, but it's also really important to taking risks, which we just used as an example, but also to lying. And you have here that the brain habituates to dishonesty. And I think this is a really incredible chapter. So can you tell us about why our emotions are really essential to lying and taking risks?
Okay, so here's the data. A bunch of people were told, we have an experiment we'd like you to participate in, where if you cooperate with a stranger on a task, you'll make some money.
Mm-hmm.
And a certain number of people, having agreed to participate in this experiment, were told, actually, you could make even more money if you lie to your partner.
Mm-hmm.
That's the design. People are told they're going to cooperate and make money, but they'll make more money if they lie.
Mm-hmm.
Question is, what will happen? And the people in the experiment their brains are being monitored to see what's actually happening inside. Okay, people do lie. It's not a horrific lie, but they lie to a stranger. When they lie, the amygdala, a part of the brain that's associated with emotions, lights up big time. Mm-hmm. So people lie. I don't know if you feel this when any of us lies, I think, unless we're, mm-hmm. have a lying issue. If we lie, there's something that's going crazy in our brain, mm-hmm. big red light. And
you're like, I'm sure I don't look like I am, but yeah, you feel like it is. Yeah.
And the brain monitor could show that people were lying, they wanted the money, but they were very agitated. As the day went on and they lied more and more, the amygdala started quieting. Mm-hmm. So the part of the brain that's agitated by moral transgressions quiets, and what was a red light or a screaming siren turns into a yellow-green light or a kind of go sign. Mm-hmm. And that's remarkable, isn't it? That the human brain habituates to one's own immorality. And it's very much, the framework we're describing, where there's diminishing sensitivity to a stimulus, where the stimulus is immorality. And I think this really does explain why in business and politics, mm-hmm. where many of us think, how can they lie so much? I mean, it's that they've done it so much, it's not even being registered by the brain as a big deal, which is a lesson for creating strong norms against lying and other transgressions, because once people start, it's like, the water's fine.
Yeah. I think one of the stories, it's really the title of this chapter, which is how to keep your child from growing a long nose. So this is applicable to parenting. I think it's probably applicable to managing. It's applicable to how we perceive information that, as you say, when we turn on a talking head on TV and you're just like, how can they say this? And so that sort of brings us to the next chapter, which is on misinformation. And we might flip that, and instead of saying, how can they say this, we might say, how can we believe this? So how do we believe this misinformation that we may intellectually know perhaps might be misinformed or incorrect, but we are still susceptible to it? How does that work?
Okay, let's do a little bit of an illustration and then an explanation. I don't know if you heard that Tom Brady, the quarterback who's retired, I don't know if you heard that he said he was going to leave broadcasting and run for governor. And it wasn't clear why he said he was running for governor, exactly what he had in mind, but he said a few things about some domestic issues that he had a view on, and that's why he's running for governor. Okay, I just lied. Tom Brady.
Oh gosh, yes, I'm like nodding. Mm-hmm.
I did it. I'm a big TV fan, so sorry, Mr. Brady. I didn't just lie one time. I lied 3 times. I said 3 times he's running for governor, and I did that because I wanted to illustrate the point. There's something called the illusory truth effect, which is if a statement is repeated more than once, twice, Actually, that's enough to get it going. People will tend to believe it's true. And there's something else called the truth bias, which means that people tend to believe statements they hear are true, even if they're told in real time that they're false. So I'm combining the illusory truth effect and truth bias by telling you that it's false and repeating the statement several times. Now you might ask, why is the illusory truth effect a thing? And it's very much connected with habituation. If you hear a statement several times, then it's very easy to process it. The mind doesn't have the surprise signal anymore. It's more just a thing. So if you hear, vitamin C, no colds, you hear that 3 times, it's kind of in the system. It's easy to process. Or if you hear that you shouldn't go out in the sun very often because you can get skin cancer. That's true, by the way, several times. It's just easy to process. And that means you accept it as true. So there's a little slogan, easier, truthier. And that's how the human mind is. Now that helps explain the power of misinformation. If you hear something, I don't know if you feel this way, I do. There are several things I've heard multiple times that I know to be false. But I've heard them a lot of times and I kind of think they're true.
Right.
I have to work on myself to think, I heard that a few times and it's really not true. And that means that social media, Hitler was very good at this, by the way. Right. And he had an intuitive understanding of the social science, which is if you repeat something a lot, people are going to start to believe it. Because it's easy. You're habitual.
You also said something, I was really fascinated by this, and correct me if I misunderstood it, because I think it's very nuanced, that when you are a person who is contradicting or opposing the misinformation, so say hypothetically, on Facebook, your Uncle Carl, who comes to Thanksgiving and has different political beliefs than you do, because he is, and he's repeating what he sees on Facebook as being true, and you say, no, this thing that you believe is true is not true. That our brains have a hard time distinguishing between rehearing that truth, even though it has some contradictory evidence to it. Is that, am I somewhere, like, I think this is fascinating for all of us who really want to argue a point, who may be reinforcing a point instead.
So you may have heard in the last period that Tom Brady is running for president. It's an interesting idea that Tom Brady is running for president, but Tom Brady is not, in fact, running for president. I'm not sure that's going to work because it's going to push in the head the suggestion Tom Brady is running for president. Right. So some social media companies have 3 options. If there's a falsehood, let's say that's harmful, and let's just stipulate it's a falsehood that's harmful. Right. One option is to take it down. So suppose the statement is, if you shoot yourself with heroin, your life expectancy goes up by 10 years. That's false and dangerous. They could take that down, or they could diminish the distribution of the statement, or they could follow the statement with a disclaimer saying this is false. Right. The evidence suggests that the third approach is hazardous. It might do much less than you expect. Some social media companies have experimented with saying false first before you use a statement. That's probably better. And in terms of correcting falsehoods, it's a great, we know the problem. We're not clear on the solution. One thing that works is if the source of the falsehood is discredited. So that, right, so you say Sunstein is always making up stuff about Tom Brady. You cannot, anything you said about Tom Brady is not going to be true. I should say I'm a huge Tom Brady fan. So there's that. Ridicule might be better than sincere engagement. So if you make people laugh at the ridiculousness of the statement, that might be smarter than the alternative.
Right. It's an interesting, fighting fire with fire versus fighting fire with water or baking soda or whatever. It gives us, it informs the way we communicate. And I think that is a really important takeaway from this book, is that this has a lot to do with how we communicate and process information from other people. And so if we move on to the next section, which is health and safety, and we talked a little, I think you mentioned in your opening reading about adapting to our environment. And one of the things, I was never on a plane where there were people smoking on a plane, because I didn't fly until I was much older. I'm sure I'm of the age, but I was in movie theaters where people were smoking in movie theaters and at malls. And we know from that experience that we adapt to things in our environment, whether it's smells or air quality or heat and coldness, because that's the way that we are wired. And in one case, in one scenario, that's good. We have to adapt. If we move from Wisconsin to Florida, we would hope to adapt to the weather in Florida. If Wisconsin suddenly becomes Florida-like weather in the middle of winter, we should probably not adapt to that, but put our finger up and say, hey, there's something wrong here. So let's talk about sort of health and safety in terms of like how the value of adapting to our environment, but the danger and essentially how that danger has played out in where we find ourselves right now in terms of, our environment.
Okay, so a number of years ago, I went to Beijing, China, and the first thing I noticed was the air quality is really bad. Air's really dirty in Beijing. I hope it's better now. And the second thing I noticed was no one seemed to notice the air quality was bad. It was just me. People habituated to the dirty air with which they lived. If you go as, let's say, a resident of a very clean place to some place in the United States called, say, Los Angeles, and on a bad day, you'll be startled, and the people there just aren't startled. With respect to all sorts of natural conditions, including ones that have danger in them, if they are pervasive, people will habituate and there won't be a surprise signal. So I had the surprise signal big time when I went to China. With climate change, it's similar. It's a slow-moving problem. And that means that if it's a little hotter in 2024 than it was in 2023, the surprise signal won't be given. But if it's a lot hotter in 2024 than it was in, let's say, 1992, that can be very, very bad. It won't be noticed by virtue of its incremental growth.
I think that is, it's a through line throughout the book, right? Is gradual adaptation to things that ultimately are dangerous. And so as we move into, I am rushing us along because it is suddenly 2:52, which is incredible. But now I am in the next part, which is society. And here we're talking about discrimination and bias and a lot of things that as a society, now that we've looked at these threads in terms of like individual life choices and the way that our brains are wired to take in information and the way that we adapt to hardships. Now we're talking about society and we're talking about discrimination and why people adapt to social norms, right? And in the ways that there are some people out there that are able to see the mistake in the fabric or the misstitch in the fabric and do take action, while many of us are simply unaware of the pattern in the fabric. And so this is a two-part question. That's the one. And then the second one is if our brains are wired to not see the misstitches in the fabric, because we're so used to the pattern being what it is. What do we do with accountability, right? Like, what do we do if someone doesn't know they did something wrong, but they did something really wrong?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. Let's talk about the basic problem. Let's suppose something is not fair or not just, or which is causing fear or distress, and it needn't and shouldn't. It shouldn't exist. People who are living with it might not notice it because they're habituated to it. You can take your pick of it might be corruption in some countries, it might be domestic violence in some countries, it might be any number of things. Okay, there are people, let's call them, we're going to give them a name, dishabituation entrepreneurs who draw attention to the non-inevitability of the thing. Mm-hmm. So Martin Luther King was a dishabituation entrepreneur. Gloria Steinem is a dishabituation entrepreneur, and they hold up a mirror kind of to a practice and say, look again.
Right.
And those people are often heroes. There can be dishabituation entrepreneurs who are terrible because they're dishabituating us to things that we rightly live with and are fine with. But society needs dishabituation entrepreneurs. Your accountability question is a fantastic one. I tend to think, this is just my nature, I'm not a punitive person. So I think if someone did something bad, and it was really definitely bad, but it was consistent with widespread social norms, I think the right reaction is stop, not,
go back.
Yeah, stop doing it.
Yeah.
Not take someone's life away in general.
Yeah, the question was prompted, I suppose, by cancel culture, or the way that we want to look back into history and hold people accountable for something that might have not been distinguishable to them at the time. And that's a very obviously complicated and nuanced situation for many.
My view, and I think this is compatible with the spirit of the book, is wrongdoing should be halted. But if there was someone in 1910, let's say, who behaved wrongly and inconsistently with contemporary norms with respect to, some equality idea, Portia put it well, the quality of mercy is not strained.
I have two questions in the Q&A here, and we have about 2 minutes to get to them. And I apologize to Kim and Allison. I think, Allison, we did touch on perhaps what you were wondering. She says, I'm wondering if one practices dishabituation, is there also a risk of getting caught in the grass is always greener cycle?
That's a great question. Yes. I think the risk for many people is not looking at the other grass rather than getting too excited about the grass. But the question's completely right.
Go ahead, sorry.
It might be that things are good and people get sometimes too excited.
It's that balance, right, between comparing and pursuing versus comparing and finding that to be a source of unhappiness, I suppose. And then Kim asks, is habituation, and this is a big topic, and the loss of our habits, places, people, etc., in part, aside from the illnesses and deaths, of course, why COVID has stolen so much from us? So COVID and habituation.
Okay, I think it's a large question. I'm just going to go at a piece of it. Do you remember a time when people had to go home and couldn't work in the office anymore? I'm in an office from which I was right now, literally, from which I was exiled in the early stages of COVID. And the idea of working at home was devastating. People felt horrified and in suspended animation, and they habituated to it. So aside from certain people, generally people's well-being grew. So I would say the main thing that COVID stole from us was the lives and health of so many, the fact that human beings were generally resilient in the way that you suggest points to the bright side of habituation.
Right. It's a big topic, and I think the book speaks, helps us process it for ourselves. And there's so much in the book that we didn't get to today, but we did touch on a lot, and we touched on a lot that is deeply meaningful to people, and why this book, I think, could and should be read by everyone. I mean, ultimately, there is a paragraph, and I'm jettisoning my conclusion, and I'm just going to read this one paragraph here before we say goodbye to you, Cass. We have, you say that after learning about all the ways people habituate, you may be able to detect and focus on the suboptimal aspects of your life to which you've become accustomed. You may notice those less fortunate features of your home life and work life and of society that you have overlooked. Granted, in many situations, you are better off accepting things that are not perfect or even not all that great. The hope, though, and this is the important part for why this book's so important, is that awareness of all the ways our brains blind us to the constant and expected will help you distinguish the chains you should accept from those that you should try to break. So that is the gift of this book, is helping us identify those things that are beneficial to us in life, and the way that our brains sometimes don't facilitate the kind of change and the kind of dishabituation that we truly need to appreciate what we have. So
Thank you so much for.
Thank you so much for the book. I hope that everyone reads it. I hope you have a great tour, however that looks, in the coming days and weeks, and tons of success to you. I'm so glad you were here, and it was fascinating.
It's a great discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.